So this is the biggest painting I ever did with pencils. I had some compositional challenges for sure. Animals rarely pose for you. Well, sometimes. Anyway, I've collected a lot of reference with photographs and videos over the years, and I've practiced a lot with these drawings, big and small, and I'll share what I've learned. I've even had to wipe out some mistakes. But I'm going to start with this moose painting because I learned a lot from it. It was pretty challenging. Let's get started.
This is a moose and not a cow, and they don't move. But thankfully it stopped anyway and gave a nice pose for my brother, who filmed it on a hunting trip we went on together a few years back. It was a good looking moose, so I decided to draw and paint it. I posted a video a while back about using ink tints and colored pencils on Yupo paper, and I mentioned that it was kind of difficult to do, and many of you commented that while you thought it was interesting, you wouldn't likely try the paper. That makes sense, but I bought a whole packet of the paper, and I still have plenty of paper left, so I'm going to keep trying to figure out what I can do with it. Because one of my main interests in exploring art is trying to learn new things, and similar to last time, I started out by drawing with colored pencils. But you can see that I decided to try out a Tombow watercolor marker here too. It's a lighter gray that I'll cover up later, but I figured this would be a more controllable way to add in some darker areas. I basically used it to fill in that entire tree area. The glare of the overhead lights is visible here while the marker is still sort of wet, but the glare will go away as it dries, so there's that. If you've ever used this paper, you'd know that the water doesn't absorb at all because it's plastic. Specifically, it's polypropylene. Water and pigment just sits on top. That can be a good or bad thing, depending on your goals. I like the abstract nature of it, and you will see how I use that to my advantage in a bit. It's kind of hard to tell, but I'm actually using 3 different shades of gray here, each a little darker than the other. I'm doing that because in the photo reference I can see that the light and dark values define the moose, and I'm trying to find where the shadows and the slight highlights are that define the moose's muscles and structure. But basically, I'm just trying to get the overall composition correct, and the value and structure of the darks and lights is an important part of that. Speaking of composition, I've grabbed this photo from the video, so I was able to pause it in just the right place. Then I extracted that frame as an image, then opened it up in my photo editor. I knew I wanted to zoom in a bit, but I also knew that the dimensions of my paper were roughly a ratio of 4:3, so I made sure I used that setting. Normally, I play with the rule of thirds and place the interesting part on one of those tic-tac-toe lines, but sometimes I just go with what looks good. Feel free to break those rules. On the sheep, I broke all kinds of rules, sort of. These are Rocky Mountain sheep, and they come further down the mountain in the winter. I had a lot of video of them, but nothing especially picturesque. On one instance, the sheep got spooked by something when I wasn't taking video, but I hurried and took a few still shots. This was one of my favorites. There are 4.5 sheep here, but I decided I actually wanted to only have 3 of the sheep in my painting. So I opened up my favorite image editor on my phone and got to work. I first created a duplicate layer. Layers allow you to do some pretty fun things, and I'm going to make one of those layers invisible for now. Then I erased all but one sheep from the top layer. I'm not trying to be too accurate because I know this is just a rough sketch. I then made the bottom layer visible, so I was able to see both layers again. Then I moved the top layer sheep using the transform layer tool in this ArtRage program, and I moved it over the other sheep. But it didn't fully remove the bottom sheep or cover them up, but it was easy to remove them by smudging it out with the blending tool, or I could have used a paintbrush tool to color over it. Either way, I'm trying to get down to just 3 sheep because I thought it made for a more interesting composition. I still don't like the background too much, so I thought it would be more interesting if the landscape was more spacious looking. So on a new layer, I erased around the 3 sheep again so I could reposition all of them to be a smaller part of the canvas. This way the landscape design would be a bit more prominent. This took some blending of the bottom layer again with a smudge tool or a pastel brush tool. Here I added the color of the snow back in, so it just looks like a bigger field of snow. I'm not too detailed here, but that's okay because you'll see I'll even change that later. A big thing that I changed is that I decided to add some sky so that it looked like they were running over the ridgeline of the mountain. That's obviously a big change from the reference photo, but I'm learning as I study other wildlife artists that it's quite common for them to combine different photos with different animal poses with different landscapes. To make it even more interesting, I'll add some jutting rock features on the left, similar to what I've seen in the habitat near where I saw these sheep, and I'll add some smaller rock features on the right side too to balance it out. Over the ridgeline, I think I'll have some distant snow-laden mountains just for creating depth and probably some clouds in the sky. Again, this is a rough sketch, but I wanted to show how it is possible to create a composition that might be better than the one from your reference photos. I know I was kind of excited about the discovery. But let's get back to the finish off that moose. One of the things that excited me about painting this moose was actually the trees behind the moose. I thought they would serve as a good background. I loved the color textures that I could potentially make to represent them. It was a really pretty area, and I'm excited to start adding some color to this. I'm using ink tints for that. I used some golden ochre, some browns, and even some blues. And I'm hoping that once I add water to this, it will all blend together and look more natural looking. I also decided to put a lot of blues in the background because that's how the trees look to me. They look blue because of the atmospheric perspective. They were actually quite a ways away, further than the photo suggests. Keeping them blue pushes them back a bit. Once I started to add water though, it all came in a bit lighter than I hoped. I think I used too much water, but I'll document it later. I kind of have to work in layers anyway, even though it's a bit harder on this paper. I also do better when my paintbrushes aren't too wet. So on this moose, I'm using a drier brush, but it's still moving the pigment a lot. But that's okay because it's blending the colors nicely. And this is very much a learn as you go type of thing. I keep adding darks with the pencils, and I'm using the brush to create the light areas, and I like the variations I've seen. It's all sort of a happy accident with this paper. Now I'm adding in more ink tints here to get the trees darker. The variation of the marks is an attempt to get the shadow and light side of each tree, but again keeping it kind of textured. There's somewhat an abstract nature of the trees, and I liked that it was fall and there was some golden aspens mixed in with the pine trees. So I'm not trying to paint each tree, except I do want to keep each of the aspens a little bit more detailed. And I'm placing them randomly and not following the reference photo too much at this point. I'm more focused on getting a nice image rather than an exact replica. I'm still using mostly ink tints pencils with a fairly dry brush, but it's still damp enough that you can see the shine from the overhead light. As the ink tints dries, it does get a little bit lighter on the paper as well. The foreground will mostly be yellow, but with a little bit of green and blue in it. And I'm still scribbling a lot, and I'm sort of testing how much will stay around once I use the water. And I keep trying different techniques. Then I ended up resorting to non-water soluble pencils. They will stay put more if I were to add water. So in some ways the ink tints was serving as an underpainting, and the non-water soluble pencils are for the darker darks. You can go back and forth with this, there's no problem with that. I'm going to use both green and blues for this, and using the side of the pencil will give me a broader stroke than the tip. And adding some brown and reds to the blues and greens and yellows will help keep it all more natural looking as well. The brushes I had were frustrating me, so I even tried using a wooden stick. It was slightly wet, and it did push the pigment around a bit, but I wouldn't say I liked the result too much, but it was worth trying. I got impatient with the water, so I used a little blow dryer to dry it faster, but if you use one, make sure it only blows cold air. The heat can make the surface separate a bit if it gets too hot. As usual, I just kept at it, trying different techniques and tools. I even used an eraser to get some of the white highlights back. The things I learned on this moose will apply to what I do for the sheep painting, especially because the sheep will be on that same type of paper. even after I thought I was done with the mousse and took the tape off, I realized that one of the things I like doing is using a bigger brush to get a less rendered look, more painterly that way. But ultimately, I liked how it turned out and I learned a ton. I also figured I needed to try some different brushes on that next painting. I guess I can't stop my art supply addictions, or trying new things. Anyway, I didn't actually film the first part of this painting with the mountain sheep. In fact, it has been weeks since I worked on it. I kind of got stuck and I wasn't sure how to finish it off. I think because it was so big that I made it too precious. So maybe with the pressure of finishing it off for this video, we can finish more of it together. But first, let's talk more about how I got to this point. I did take some still shots of the process along the way, and here you can see that I did a pretty detailed drawing with graphite. I discovered that graphite works really well on this paper, and once I was satisfied with the sheep, I added a horizon line and the rocks. I took a bunch of reference photos of rocks in the snow, but there wasn't much snow this year, so I didn't find what I wanted. Also, after trying to actually paint snow, I decided it was beyond my skill level, and I decided a late fall scene would work too, so I started to use yellow for some of the grasses. I collected a bunch of photos of similar landscapes without snow, and decided to use those for inspiration instead. I even gathered some distant mountain shots with sky and clouds to use, and that got me to this point. I actually used a lot of traditional watercolor for this. You can see some of the textures I was able to get, and I was pretty pleased with most of it. I used both Inktense and traditional watercolor, and they both worked pretty good over that graphite, since the graphite stayed put and the watercolor played fairly nicely if it didn't get too wet. That's similar to what I learned on the mousse. When I showed the painting to my family, my son said that he thought the distant mountains were too prominent, too big. I agreed, so after trying to wipe them off with a rag, I decided I needed to use an eraser to remove them. I think the main thing I like about this paper is that I can actually erase. Those mountains were drawn with Inktense pencils, so they didn't remove with the rag I used, but this eraser did a great job of it. You can't even tell they were there. I guess I've always wanted to be able to move mountains. Was that a dad joke? Since erasing it did leave some white, I mixed up the same watercolors I used for painting, like I did in an earlier stage. These are the golden QOR watercolors. They are seriously pigmented and vibrant, but I'll apply them with plenty of water, because I want the sky at the horizon to appear lighter, and I'm not worried about being too smooth with the application of it, because I still want it to appear cloudy. So I won't spend too much time on this. Impressionistic is the goal here for sure. By the way, the brush I used here was actually a very cheap brush, commonly used for glue. It worked great because it wasn't really absorbent at all. I'll have to tell you more about that in my next video. I used a smaller mono zero eraser here to return some of the whites that were part of that mountain sheep's legs. And the rest of this painting is going to be just fiddling around trying to put back in the details, without ruining the looseness that I worked hard to achieve in the first place. This paper is designed to encourage a looser style, but it's nice that you can use tools to rein it in, like pencils and erasers. I think finishing a painting is the hardest part. I know I didn't share the whole painting process here, but I hope it was interesting enough to learn how I composed it. It actually was my favorite part of the whole painting. Starting and composing a painting is fun for me, especially if it involves going outside. There are so many possibilities when I start, but when it comes to finishing, I'm never sure when to stop or when to consider it done. I think the ultimate answer to that is I just get tired of it. Sometimes I come back to them, and sometimes I don't. Sometimes I can get lost in the details, but other times the details frustrate me. I bet I painted the eyes on these sheep like a billion times, at least 3 or 4. I just kept painting them, and then I'd wipe them out, and then I'd paint them again, and I'd wipe them out. I could never really get them quite the right place, and getting the darks and lights to work was kind of difficult, but I'm getting closer each time I do it, so it's been good practice, and I think if I'm just patient, it'll all work out. And I know that part of this is just getting lost in the process and doing it. So I like that. So is this one done? Maybe. I know I painted on that moose after I took out the tape, but will I on this one? Maybe not. But I do think this video is about done. Thanks for watching and exploring art with me. See you in the next one.